Gilles de Rais was the kind of man medieval Europe created when brilliance, privilege, war trauma, unchecked power, and absolute impunity collided with a mind cracking along its own fault lines. Born in 1405 into one of the wealthiest noble families in France, heir to vast lands, castles, and privileges, Gilles should have become a respected lord, a pillar of the kingdom, a figure sung by poets. Instead, he became one of the darkest legends in European history, a man who stood at the side of Joan of Arc as a hero of France, and then, after her death, descended into madness, obsession, and crime so disturbing that even his executioners whispered prayers while chaining him. His childhood laid the foundation, aristocratic upbringing mixed with brutality, a father who died young, relatives who fought over custody like vultures, a world where nobles learned to kill before they learned to write, and where violence was not a sin, but a currency. Gilles grew up in castles heavy with tapestries, gold, and political intrigue, surrounded by servants who would never dare say no to him, educated in theology, languages, warfare, and the belief that nobility placed him closer to God than common people would ever be. At 15, he was already fighting, commanding troops, witnessing horrors of the 100 Years' War, burned villages, mutilated bodies, starving peasants, screaming men dying in mud, scenes that carved deep wounds into his psyche long before history would accuse him of carving wounds into others. But he was talented, a brilliant soldier, charismatic commander, fearless knight, and then destiny connected him with someone who would define both his glory and his doom, Jeanne d'Arc. When the teenage peasant girl arrived to save France, many nobles mocked her, but Gilles saw something else, a force, a symbol, an impossible spark of divine fire. He became one of her most loyal captains, riding beside her in battles at Orléans, Jargeau, Bataille, and during the coronation at Reims. Chroniclers describe him as bold, flamboyant, draped in lavish armor, thundering into combat with the same reckless courage as the Maid of Orleans, a knight wrapped in gold fighting for a future he believed Jeanne embodied. He rose to national fame. The king rewarded him richly, but Jeanne's death shattered something inside him. Watching her burned at Rouen marked him permanently, not out of love or romance, but because she had been the only moral compass he ever responded to, a living reminder of purpose, faith, restraint. When she died, that compass burned with her. After the war, Gilles returned to his estates with money, fame, and nothing to guide him. He began spending recklessly. Feasts, entertainers, musicians, actors, alchemists, astrologers. He burned through wealth like a man trying to fill a void that only widened. His castles became theaters of absurd extravagance. Servants described him as restless, unpredictable, torn between religious guilt and decadent indulgence. He funded bizarre alchemical experiments in hopes of creating gold because he had already squandered his fortune. Quacks, magicians, and charlatans flocked to his court, promising miracles to a man desperate for control over a life that felt increasingly hollow. And then, gradually, secretly, the disappearances began. The children vanished around his estates. At first it was whispered, a missing boy here, a servant's child there, a page who never returned. But in a world where peasants had no rights and nobles answered to no one, whispers dissolved into silence, and silence allowed darkness to grow. His crimes, reconstructed from testimonies, confessions, contradictions, and legend, remain a mixture of truth and horror shaped by centuries of retellings. Whether the exact numbers were dozens or hundreds, whether some accusations were exaggerated or politically motivated, one fact is certain. Something monstrous happened behind his castle walls. Servants later described how Gilles lured children, boys mostly, sometimes girls, into the castle under pretext of employment or service. How once inside, he transformed from the charismatic war hero into someone unrecognizable, manic, ecstatic, violent, consumed by impulses he could neither control nor resist. But even in this darkness, what stands out is not merely cruelty. It is the complete breakdown of a man whose soul had rotted long before his crimes reached their peak. Some historians argue he suffered from post-traumatic psychological collapse. Others point to spiritual despair after Jean's death. Others believe he was simply a predator given infinite power. The truth likely lies in the horrifying middle, a nobleman spiraling into madness in a system that shielded him from consequences until it was too late. Eventually, even the church could no longer ignore the rumors. Bishop Jean de Malestroit launched an investigation, partly out of moral duty, partly because Gilles' reckless financial decisions made him a liability, and partly because political enemies wanted him removed. When investigators searched Gilles' castles, they claimed to find evidence of killings, bones, testimony from terrified servants, accounts too consistent to dismiss entirely. Gilles was arrested in 1440 and put on trial, an extraordinary event because nobles did not face such tribunals unless their crimes were undeniable or politically convenient. The trial was a spectacle. Dozens of witnesses, gruesome descriptions, servants detailing rituals, mutilations, and Gilles' strange habit of mixing prayer with violence, begging forgiveness moments after committing atrocities. The court blended legal procedure with religious pressure. Inquisitors demanded not only confessions of crime, but of spiritual fall. Gilles, confronted with overwhelming accusations, eventually broke. He confessed, some say out of guilt, others out of fear, others because he hoped confession would spare him torture. His confession remains one of the most disturbing documents of medieval Europe, calm, articulate, analytical, as if he described someone else's nightmare. He expressed remorse, begged forgiveness, and requested last rites. The judges condemned him to death, but offered him a dignity peasants would never receive, execution by hanging and burning, but with a promise of burial in consecrated ground, a privilege for nobles even in disgrace. On the morning of October the 26th, 1440, Gilles walked to the gallows dressed in white, holding a cross, weeping not out of fear, but out of overwhelming shame. Thousands watched as the former hero of France, the knight who fought beside Jeanne d'Arc, the Marshal of France, swung between heaven and earth, the violent end of a man who had once wielded greatness and then surrendered it to the darkest places inside himself. But the story of Gilles de Rais does not end with his death, because centuries later, a new controversy arose. Was he truly guilty, or was he framed? Some modern historians argue the trial was a political hit job. The Duke of Brittany wanted Gilles' lands. The church wanted a moral victory. The king wanted to erase embarrassing nobles, and the accusations, despite consistency, contained contradictions common in cases shaped by torture. The theory suggests he was targeted for wealth, not crimes. But most scholars, weighing testimonies, patterns, recovered remains, and psychological behavior, believe that although the legend inflated the numbers, Gilles was still responsible for horrific acts. The truth is chilling because it blends possibility with certainty. Whether he killed 30 children or 300, whether some details were exaggerated or not, Gilles de Rais remains one of history's darkest warnings, proof that power without oversight devours the human soul, that trauma can deform a man into a monster, and that the line between hero and horror can be unbearably thin. He stands today as a tragic paradox, a celebrated war hero who became a symbol of medieval cruelty, a man who fought beside a saint and then fell into depravity, a noble whose downfall exposed the rot in a system where wealth shielded sin until sin spilled beyond containment. He is not merely a villain, he is a cautionary tale about unchecked privilege, the corruption of absolute authority, and the terrifying depths one can fall into when the world lets a broken man break others. And perhaps that is why the legend endures. Because Gilles de Rais isn't a supernatural monster or mythic demon, He is what happens when history gives one man everything except a reason to remain human.